I wish I could be there, but maybe in a different time, this would be more possible. What I wanted to just have some brief comments is to address kind of the elephant in the room, which has already been discussed, and that is, what is the metaverse? And no one at this point could give a satisfactory answer, partly because there is no metaverse for us to dig into and point that out. All the details, all the benefits, all the little nuances of the metaverse. So instead, what I like to do is to imagine that we have a time machine, and we're going to go back to the fall of 1995 and to a very specific time. And that's going to be around 1 in the morning, 12:30 at night, depending on your time zone. And we're going to turn on NBC Network. And we're going to turn on the Dave Letterman show. And we're going to watch Dave talk to Bill Gates. Because the sole purpose of Bill Gates being a guest of Dave is to explain to Dave what this whole internet thing is. And we're all going to laugh, and we're all going to come away several minutes later agreeing with Dave that the whole internet thing is really, not everyone's cup of tea, and that more likely not, it's really not something to get excited about. Bill Gates tries to get Dave excited about this by mentioning that, hey, you will be able in about a week to listen to a Major League Baseball game that is going to be streamed on your computer. Dave says, like, wow, that's great. Have you heard of this thing called radio? Is his answer. Everyone chuckles, everyone laughs, and break to commercial. And we find ourselves today in the same conversation of trying to explain what the metaverse is, why it's potentially exciting, interesting, without being able to really give case studies that 20, 30 years from now are going to be very common to all of us. So just like the tools for small businesses in 1995 were landline, fax machines, go forward today, those same tools that businesses rely on are now cell phones, printer, copier, a desktop machine, likely a relationship with a digital platform like DoorDash, if you're a restaurant. And so basically what has happened is that the same technology that fax machine displaced, a cell phone displaced a landline, a MP3 file displaced CDs, and CDs displaced cassettes, and cassettes displaced LPs, and now LPs are somewhat displacing MP3 files or their variant. Our engagement with digital is the reality rather than the exception. And so using that as a hypothesis, let's now talk about the metaverse as a potential next evolution, displacement, whatever term you want to use. I don't like using those kind of negative terms, but let's say evolution. How can we then begin to talk about the next evolution of the internet in ways that is founded on what we have learned has occurred in the past, and then use our learnings from the past that have been thoroughly or as best analyzed as possible to have these conversations. And so using that as kind of a benchmark of let's have a balanced conversation, my team engaged analysis group to answer a simple question, but a very difficult question about what is the economic impact of the metaverse. And since there is no metaverse to measure, as I already have said, we look back to a more recent technology that has matured, that has gone through what we think the metaverse will go through in terms of adoption, in terms of having to solve for so many different aspects. like the internet solved for, like other technologies have solved for. And so we looked at analysis group to give us a possible framing that would be transparent in terms of methodology, that would rely on existing tools that anyone who has a PhD in econometrics would be able to judge for themselves, replicate as needed. And the bottom line answer was that the metaverse, 10 years after adoption, would be expected to contribute about 2.8% of global GDP. So putting that into a more concrete number, what we did was say, okay, what if 10 years from now, that is 2022, so now we're talking 2031, what is the GDP in 2031? And therefore, what is 2.8% of that GDP? And that number is about $3 trillion globally. And then we were able to break that down regionally. Again, this is based on mobile technology, the data that mobile technology has provided us. So that is I think, a starting point for conversations about the economic impact of something that's not real. And so how can then we start talking about putting together the different components that will realize that potential of $3 trillion in 10 years, but we know that it's going to ramp up to $3 trillion and eventually keep going up. So it's a great time to be talking about this because it's all about possibilities and everything is on the table at this point. So I'm really thankful for being here to talk with everyone. Diane, I'll pass it over to you so you can have your say as well.
Thanks very much, Arturo, and hello, everybody. I'm in London, so I'm going to say good evening to all of you. So Arturo took us back to the past, and my first book about the impact that digital technologies would have on our societies and economies was published 25 years ago this year, 1997. So my claim to fame is that I actually anticipated David Bowie, who in a late night TV show in the UK was incredibly prescient about what the impacts of the internet, about the internet and about its impacts might be. I think about the effects of technologies in a way that's broader than just GDP measurement. Important as that is for jobs and living standards, I think we all know that some of the things that we care about in society don't get captured in that single metric. And while it's important to think about that, we would think about other aspects as well. And in a way, this is more true of the digital economy and the metaverse than of the old-fashioned pre-digital economy. And that's because we're all well aware of the network effects, the spillovers, the externalities, both positive and negative, that this technology has brought into our societies. And also because innovation is actually just very hard to measure in the conventional statistics, because what innovations do is transform our lives in a qualitative way as well as a quantitative way. Just think about the possibility of connecting with family members across the world during the pandemic, when those kinds of communications might have taken weeks or months with previous technologies. And so a lot of economists now are looking at measuring the impact of technology and innovation beyond GDP. And for example, Peterson at Stanford, my team here in the UK have looked at what do people state would be their willingness to pay, how much would they pay not to be deprived of certain technologies. But what I'm thinking about now is what's the best framework for thinking about digital technologies, progress, the metaverse, this ongoing transition that we're making in the underlying structures of our economies, which we think about as intangible. It's all about things that happen online, but there's a very tangible aspect to it as well. And what is progress is a really ancient question. And so we're thinking about that by thinking in terms of what are the new opportunities that are created by technology using the same resources or even using fewer resources. Those might be opportunities for small businesses in low-income countries to access markets. It might be those personal opportunities to make connections that otherwise we couldn't have. So what are the opportunities? What's being opened up to us with the resources that we have available? And that's the fundamental economic question about productivity broadly defined. But also who can benefit and where are they? Who is underserved and what kind of progress could we make if we could share the benefits of the technology more broadly? And my sense is that a lot of the conversation is about negative aspects of technology. And of course, we need to think about those, and our institutions and our regulations and legal frameworks haven't caught up with what's been going on. But there's lots of untapped potential as well. So that's an important aspect to thinking about the governance. So my team at the moment is looking at two areas that are absolutely fundamental to human lives: finance, access to financial services, and transport, mobility. So what are the innovations, of course? What are the opportunities being opened up? Who's not able to access those? And what are the governance and business models that might change that? What are the investments needed? Many years ago, in the mid-2000s, I worked on a mobile payment technology in Kenya, operated by Safaricom, called M-Pesa, which brought millions of people into the realm of financial services for the first time. They were not profitable for banks to serve, so they wanted to send money to a relative in the city, they had to entrust cash to a bus driver and hope that it got there. So all of those new opportunities were opened up by the technology, but it took investment in hardware and networks. It took a new business model innovation, and it took a different regulatory framework to enable all of that to happen. So those are the kinds of areas where we need to think about, from my perspective as a professor of public policy, how do we address the negative aspects, mitigate the risks, but also open up opportunities to make sure they're as widely shared as possible. And also think about what's the data that doesn't exist. If you're thinking about something like a transport network, many of us use apps that we're always connected. We can shorten our journey time, avoid disruption. But what about people who want to get to a job in a neighboring city, but there's no bus route? What about the data that doesn't exist? You can be transparent in the digital world, but you can also be invisible, and neither of those is fantastic. So we're not going to come out with a single number, and I do think the single numbers are important because that's the kind of scale that enables investment and encourages governments to regulate appropriately. But a scorecard, thinking about what opportunities, who can benefit from them, and where are they? So this is work in progress. I hope you'll tune in a few months' time to find out where we got to. But now, Matt, let me hand back to you.
Great. Thank you both. Arturo, you said that everything is on the table. So I am going to start by asking you a difficult question, which is about the fact that a lot of people don't trust your company, Meta. Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, which is, in fairness, a competitor of yours in the metaverse, says, quote, "There are two sides to Meta. You have, on one hand, a vision of the metaverse that is open and interoperable, which is what you're largely describing here. And then you have your, quote, actual existing business practices, which are closed and controlling." That's my spin on it. So assuming that your projections are correct of this multi-trillion-dollar benefit, why should the public trust Meta to drive innovation in such a big sector of the economy?
Yeah, no, I think that's everything on the table means discussing everything. And I'm an economist, right? Which everyone always gets upset about when I say that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I can't be Truman's, I just want a one-handed economist, because then I'd stop being an economist. And so I'll actually will take a step back and challenge many points of that statement as an economist. Because on the other hand, there are a lot of things about that statement that are not intellectually on point. So, for example, one of the things about what was said is that it's not Meta that's building the metaverse, right? It is that the metaverse is going to be built, and we just happen to have been rebranded as Meta because we think that that is going to be the future, and we want to be part of that future. And so Meta is not, to your point, we're not dictating standards, we're not dictating what the Meta will look like. We're not going to be a toll booth standing on the expressway, nor should anyone. And that's one of the things that we are saying. And so when you say, you know, how can we trust you? We are saying that, so we're not going to change our minds 20 years from now and say, you know, the metaverse is actually a $10 trillion business, not 3. And so it's more valuable than anyone anticipated. Therefore, Meta should get its cut. That also means, for example, that any one company should not be responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of that. Just like Netflix should not be responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of our current internet, the same thing will be true of the metaverse. Just like in 2009 through, say, 2017, the BlackBerry was the dominant, when I say dominant, I mean market share, not dominant in terms of what lawyers would say, but the market share of the BlackBerry would potentially be deemed as untrustworthy, right? How do I know that I can trust a company like BlackBerry? Because at the end of the day, companies have to profit maximize. So to be naive and say companies will not profit maximize is starting from the wrong place. We don't trust governments who by themselves do not profit maximize, right? So I think the question is not necessarily the right question, but rather, what are the alternatives when there is a perception that company X does not serve the needs that a customer or the ecosystem is providing? And as long as there are alternatives, then the mechanisms that will generate so-called trust or more levels of engagement or more levels of willingness to experiment with that and purchase from that company will be realized. And the question is, how can regulation play a positive role to ensure that both alternatives are available, accessible, and that the opportunity for the users, the customers, potential customers, are able to actually realize and activate those alternatives as soon as possible. Those are kind of the more interesting questions that we need to be talking about, rather than saying, you know, Meta is the new Rockefeller of the 1800s, and that we're blowing up railroads and blowing up our competitors. I think that's not a necessarily fruitful way to think about the way that we can move forward, and how Meta is trying to be transparent and trying to be part of the solution rather than trying to say this is our piece of the pie.
Diane, turning to you, 2 questions. One, do you think that we are well positioned right now to move in that sort of open, free competition direction that Arturo is describing here as the ideal? And 2, do you think this analogy to the mobile phone revolution makes sense? Is that the right way that we ought to be thinking about the metaverse right now?
So to answer your first question, let me pick up from where Arturo left off. part of my area of research is competition economics. I spent 8 years as a competition regulator here in the UK. And I also took part in a review chaired by Jason Furman for our previous Chancellor of the Exchequer to think about competition in digital markets. And the analysis that we published was about the way that economies of scale and network effects mean that in digital markets, you're quite likely to have one company dominant at any time. And if you look back, that was the case with Internet Explorer or MySpace before Facebook overtook it. And so the question in those markets is, can new entrants get in? And I think the answer is that we're not sure at the moment, but the metaverse is actually an opportunity because there are innovations, new kinds of technological service product coming along. One of the issues for me is about data access. In the UK, we have what's called open banking, which means that the high street banks, there are 4 of them, they dominate the market. There is now a structure whereby they have to share with permission their customer data so that credentialed new entrants can access that data and use it in the same way. So question, could that be something that might be of interest in other digital markets? So I think at the moment it's an open question. And as you know, lots of competition authorities around the world are thinking about this. It's not just in the United States. So we'll find out. But I do think the metaverse and this new iteration of the digital technologies is an innovation for new entry. And even the threat of new entry is a good thing because that will keep companies like Meta on their toes, and they would have to innovate for consumers as well. On the analogy to the mobile phone revolution, there are some points of comparison, I think. And as part of the work I did in the mid-2000s was, for example, about what were the market opportunities created for SMEs or sole traders in countries in sub-Saharan Africa or in India to use information to access markets or to increase their productivity. And that was certainly true. And I think that's probably also the case now. Thinking about this through the lens of developed markets and growing markets is low-income markets is very different because the surrounding infrastructure they have, the surrounding markets they have are so different. So it won't by any means be a perfect analogy, but there will be opportunities for productivity gains and for also all the personal benefits that we have. I caught the end of the previous session, somebody talked about data localization. And I think that's actually a potentially dangerous path for middle income and low income countries to go down because they need access to cloud computing for their SMEs and bigger companies to be able to tap into the full potential. And not every country in warm places is going to get its own sophisticated large data centers. So I'd hope for a more granular regulatory and global conversation about that.
Arturo, I'm going to want to get your response, and then I'm going to ask the audience here for questions because we're going to run through time, and I'll look at a lot of this stuff. Arturo, over to you.
Well, yeah, I think I'll talk first about the last point you raised, Matt, about the analogy, and the answer is if there was a perfect analogy, we would have sought it out, and B, we'd call it the metaverse, right? So from a purely empirical, purely practical point of view, we did spend a lot of time talking with analysis group about what they thought would be the best technology to use. And the report, which is available for attendees, discusses the various options that were considered and the strong literature review on the economics and innovation that was done to try to assess how we landed on the cell phone industry. So that's, again, an unclear answer from an economist that you always should expect. I'm more than anything else, I wanted this to be the beginning of an opportunity for conversation. So a challenge that I want to put out there is for those interested researchers to find closer technologies for analysis and for similar exercise of being transparent, of taking our existing tools to analyze this question so that we can have this apples to apples comparison and continue to improve the conversation, whether it's next month, 2 years from now, or 10 years from now. And then, you know, on question of competition, we always, I'm not an economist that focuses on competition. I know enough to get myself in trouble. But one of the anecdotes I keep using is that as evolution of technologies occurs, what is happening in the background is that new consumers, new users are coming into the fold. Someone in the previous panel mentioned walled gardens and their preference for that approach initially, at least. And I would actually want to challenge that hypothesis, because I think an approach like that, where you have a walled garden, is going to reduce the opportunity for innovation. It's going to increase the likelihood that there is less competition. It is going to increase the likelihood that fewer people are able to benefit as quickly as they might otherwise benefit. And I'll use a perfect example that about Meta. Right now, the poster child for the metaverse is this thing here, right? This Oculus headset. And within Oculus headset, the sub poster child would be a video game. But that is not necessarily where the metaverse is actually going to go. It's going to go in a completely different direction. So to limit, to create a walled garden of metaverse games is going to invite further participation by those that are interested in metaverse games, audio, video reality, XR reality, right? The XR type experiences, at the exclusion of those that would be interested in, say, a Calm app, right? If you know what Calm is, or exercise, or the ability of older people who are less, more stuck in their ways. I include myself in that now, to start using this technology. And so there are ways that approach of a walled garden would exactly fall into this trap of decreasing competition, decreasing innovation, and decreasing the potential benefits. Let's not get started in standard wars, VHS versus beta, HDR 10 plus versus Dolby Vision, right? Verizon's network versus AT&T, GSM, American GSM versus European GSM, and so on, right? These standard wars are part of a evolution of markets, but what can we do to shorten these, right? Why did the European Commission feel compelled to enforce UCSB cables all over Europe? And it took them, how many years to get to this point? So anyway, I was saying that there's what we expect to happen with the metaverse has already been experienced. How can we learn from that to get to a quicker and more beneficial outcome?
All right, questions. I see one in the back, so let's start there. I'd love to get some online questions too.
Thanks so much. So my question is to Diane, based on a couple of interpretations of the kind of economic analysis given here. I think the importance of looking back is important to learn, but all of the lessons you cited disregarded the genocidal, market destroying, profession destroying impacts. And so my question to Diane is, how do we learn from these experiences and counteract the idea that there is learning going on, that an essentially company that has completely breached human trust should be trusted? It seems like a silly question. So what are the economic responses we can give to say, like, this isn't just about profit maximization. We should have realized we need to support human rights and democratic governance. Thank you.
Question for Diane, but I will let Arturo follow up afterwards.
So yes, let's start with an easy question. I mean, one answer is that economics doesn't answer all the questions. And there are clearly aspects of what's happening that are about politics or culture, and the economic criteria, the economic efficiency criteria are not the ones that you would bring to bear on that. And I think part of the challenge with digital has been how slow many governments have been to think about what are the appropriate forms of governance, regulation, and business models in this territory. For example, in the dawn of the internet in the 1990s, governments decided that they would not tax a lot of online activities, and that they would not decide to regulate online media activities in the way that offline media activities were already regulated. By the time they got around to thinking about that, it was too large scale a challenge really to be able to do it. The government in the UK is grappling with these, how to think about regulating online harms, what are the responsibilities of companies like Meta. So they're really important questions, but I don't think thinking about economic efficiency is the right way to tackle those questions.
And I agree, actually, and I think that's the challenge, is that I want to raise everyone's conversation to the next level. You know, I find it really, from a clinical point of view only, clinical economist point of view, that we don't have a shared measure of trust, right? Like the hypothesis behind the statement is, I forget exactly how it was phrased, but it was pretty damning. Meta has breached humanity's trust, something to that effect.
I think you were accused.
Right. So I'm not going to argue about the facts about that. Rather, I want to talk about, well, how do we measure trust in a way that is satisfactory, so that actions taken to address that can be assessed in a neutral way, and then judged to see if more actions can be taken, right? So for me, the question is not about denying and showcasing the positives only. I very much challenge myself and my team, and see internally this pro and cons assessment that is always happening, but you need measurements. And one of the realities is that we do not have a shared regulatory sense of what these different components of regulation, how they should be measured, how benefits should be measured against the impacts. And I agree that it's not just economic, not just economic efficiencies, right? Because we know of market failures as someone who has experienced that. And so it's not that it's about denial, but rather it's how can we take this as a starting point and then challenge our own systems. And as researchers, I would encourage more development, more proposals of these types of measures that can be at least shared with others, so that we can then start talking about, these are, this is the dashboard, and it's gone up and it's gone down. But we all agree, yes, it's gone up and or has gone down. At this point, we don't have that.
Hi, thanks. So initially I had a fun question about Abba's avatars for Diane, but Arturo, you inspired me since you mentioned about regulations, and since the metaverse will likely be driven by ads. So since we're in DC, we're talking about regulations. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You know, if I were to accept ads from, say, China to, you know, run for election and city mayor, right? I'd have to report that as a, you know, foreign agent brokering that purchase. So how does a company in the metaverse respond and comply to those types of current regulations? Thank you.
Whew. Too bad we're not there to talk about starting a VC fund for that company. We are in a digital economy at the moment. Borders in a digital economy don't exist. And yet we live within borders. And so the contradiction of a nation state with a global economy are more real than ever. For the last 700 years at least, since Venice became a global power and showed us the value of breaking down or going to across the other border, we keep learning about, well, then how does a nation manage its own interests around things like culture, things like values that are consistent with others' cultures and others' values. Regulating those aspects of within the border while signals and products are crossing the border is not a new challenge. It's how do we take what we are doing into the digital realm and then at the same time try to not stop or prevent the benefits of that digital opportunity. So the answer is that the previous models, I think, don't work, or will not be fully applicable, and for that reason will not work 100% of the time. So we have to be constantly developing and thinking about what is not working, right? And so that, again, that's not an answer that you might want, but I think it's about that innovation is not just about technology, but about how policy and about how society is innovating its own rules and its own values to correspond to situations like the one you just described. And then I would also say that whatever the United States comes up with as an answer is unlikely to be applicable in other nations, right? And so how does then the U.S. Trade delegation deal with another trade delegation who disagrees with that stance, right? So it's not just that we need to solve for our own situation in this particular context, but then take it to the next level and say, we're also in an international community.
Could I come in on that, Matt, please? I spent some years as a trustee of the BBC, which has a commercial arm that has to make money from advertising and serves many overseas markets, including markets in the United States. And those decisions are difficult. There are judgment calls, and sometimes BBC editors made the wrong call, and there was a whole editorial process about what were acceptable ads and which were not. So being a profit-seeking company doesn't have to mean that you maximize the value of every potential advert that's offered to you. But let me try this out in an American audience. I think the mixed market model is also a very healthy one. In broadcast markets in the UK, the presence of the BBC competing on dimensions other than how many viewers do you get and does that maximize your advertising revenue has been very healthy. So I would hope that in the world of the metaverse, we get some mixed business models, and it's not all advertising driven. So companies that select that will do their best to maximize their revenue that way, but there'll be other companies that actually, through the competitive process, temper some of the excesses that you might fear.
We've got time for maybe two, if we can squeeze something quick. In the back, go ahead. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My question is for Arturo as well. So based on what happened in the last decade and a half, there was a laissez-faire kind of environment on Facebook, the previous avatar of your company, that led to the proliferation of, among other things, hate speech, misinformation. By the time you started developing standards, many people thought it was not adequate. And you also encountered domestic regimes which did not want you to enforce standards in many parts of the world. Now, based on that experience, how are you creating economic incentives and a business model which will not rely on the same principles that led to the proliferation of hate, for which there is enormous public demand? And the second is, how will you stand up to regimes which don't want you to do that and which want you to continue to be a platform for that kind of hate? You know, I can see the possibilities, and I don't want to just box you in, and I know you're getting different questions, but do you have been responsible for the devastating destruction of democracies in many societies? And it's very scary that metaverse, of which you will command a big slice of the market share, will become hate-verse. And we want, that question is coming from that skepticism and fear.
Arturo, you're on mute, unfortunately.
There's always one person right in a Zoom call. I unfortunately can't, answer in very deep way your question and concern, since I'm not in that part of the company. I'm an economist. I can tell you about beta hat and standard errors and variances and market failures and of that, and network effects. And so to that extent, how information flows through network effects is one of the ways I think about things. Someone in the previous call mentioned something about Bill Clinton's love child being a UFO or something like that, right? So on the one hand, we have news, we've had newsstands, and we've had entertainment as part of our cultural background. And early on, the public sphere, the public square, sorry about that is the soapbox where one person gets their turn to speak, has now been altered so that everyone has the same microphone. There you go. And so the question is what are the mechanisms that behavior economics, for example, can tell us would be more effective at stemming what you just mentioned? For instance, I find Reddit to be really an interesting model where moderation, where each subreddit is moderated. And there's a person who has ownership, like a better word, for what happens in the subreddit, right? And it's not a free space for everything, although there is that. And so an opportunity to create an incentive for less of that proliferation of negative information, or what someone might deem to be negative, I would like to see more of. At the same time, when I think about the counterfactual of let's say not having Meta exist in the world, right? The counterfactual to that is what would take its place? Would MySpace have continued? And who would be the owner of MySpace, and what would be their editorial stance, right? And what about if TikTok becomes the dominant market share social media platform? How are we going to then deal with that? So it's not just that are the actions that Meta has taken or not taken, but it's also the proliferation that occurs as a consequence of digital media, of the digital markets, digital economy, network effects, and how we can bring to bear research-based approaches to mitigate some of these. And I would posit that there are already some efforts underway that are making things better. But again, whatever problem we solve tomorrow, we need to already be innovating for the solution that we don't even know will need to be in place for tomorrow, for the next problem that arises.
All right, I promised that we would get them out of here by the end of the hour, and so I'm going to have to leave it here. Thank you both very much for your time and for your comments. Everyone, can we get a round of applause for that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Again, if you haven't seen the report, it's downstairs.